and welcome to today's broadcast. The idea for today's broadcast actually was born in one of my closed Facebook groups. So if you're watching this on Facebook, the link is actually attached, so feel free to join. And if you're watching this on any other of my social media channels, I'll leave a hint where you can find us basically. So today's subject or topic are semi-occluded vocal tract exercises. Some of you might have heard the term straw phonation or straw exercises, and they seem to be all the rage at the moment. Everyone in the singing world, or even acting world as well, seems to be talking about them. Truth is, they're actually not that new. Singing teachers and voice teachers in general have been using them for a very long time actually. It's just that a lot of people probably heard about these exercises on YouTube or watched videos on YouTube, and a lot of people use straws for them, and it also makes sense to use them. I'll get to that later. But bear in mind that everything where your mouth is essentially covered is a semi-occluded vocal tract exercise. So you can do them like this, you can do them like that, even lip trills count as semi-occluded exercises, or hums. So as I said, it's not really that new. The idea of all semi-occluded vocal tract exercises is that through the smaller opening you create more back pressure. So that makes it easier to phonate, and it takes some stress off the vocal folds, which basically is especially helpful if you feel you've been talking too much, or you had a really exhausting gig, you feel a bit under the weather vocally, maybe you're suffering from an allergy or a slight cold, you feel the voice is a tiny bit affected. So they're really, really good to warm up the voice, but also to de-stress the voice essentially. So they're very gentle on the voice. Goes without saying, if you feel that anything is seriously amiss, always see your ENT or a laryngologist. So if nothing clears in a reasonable amount of time, then you need to be seen. Also, the reason why people like to use straws is they elongate the vocal tract a tiny bit further than, for instance, just going so that helps with more back pressure. But it's always good not to start with too much too soon, because the smaller the diameter of the straw is, the more back pressure you create, and you need to play around with it a tiny bit. So for some people, if they're using really small straws, it might actually be a tiny bit too much and they feel they don't respond to it that well. For others, if they use a straw with quite a big diameter, they all of a sudden feel that it doesn't seem to have any effect whatsoever. So as I said, try it a tiny bit, and I'll walk you through a couple of ideas or what you can do with them essentially. What I like using in my own studio for starters is actually a kazoo. It's also, there's a little fun element to it. These ones, they're really, really cheap. You can get them for literally a pound at Poundland or in a pound store or something. This particular one is actually created to use the wider side. That's not really the norm, so some of them want you to use the smaller side, but I tried it, both sides work essentially. So what you would be doing with this one, you make sure that your lips are closing really tightly around the end of it. Okay, so there's no air supposed to escape. And then you're just using that for your warm-up. For a little glide. So what I'm essentially doing is I'm thinking of a hum sound when I'm doing that. Play around with it a bit. You can also use a B sound. And the interesting bit about a kazoo is you're just not blowing into it, you actually have to hum into it. So you have to create sound, otherwise the little membrane and it won't be vibrating. So you notice straight away, maybe if you're not humming, if you're not voicing, and that gives you feedback straight away. So that's really good for a little quick warm-up. You can also use that to go through passages of songs that you find particularly stressful, that don't work that well, where you feel, oh, maybe I'm not really getting into it for whatever reason. Needless to say, there's always more than one reason why certain sound production can go wrong, but it's worth a try. So this is the kazoo. Then the reason why people like using the straws, especially in water, is because you also get a visual feedback, and I'll demonstrate to you how that works. So you get a glass of water, or you can even use a water bottle for that, or these mason jars work quite well as well, and you fill it halfway up roughly, okay? And you can use that unvoiced, so you're basically just blowing into it for starters, and you try to keep your eye on the fact that the surface of the water bubbles evenly. You can do that as a little breathing exercise as well. And then you maybe alternate between that and slightly voiced sounds. So what I'm doing is I'm literally blowing first, and then I'm using an ooh sound. And what you want is that the surface of the water doesn't do crazy things, essentially, so that the bubbling cuts out completely or goes towards the other side, that it really sort of bubbles right up. That's why the mason jars are quite good, because you won't splash your face. And so that would be for starters, essentially. And then you can move on, and you can use that for two things. You can actually monitor what happens when you're going into your higher range, for instance, if you're doing glides, or if you're practicing little arpeggios, or even if you're singing your songs and there's particular bits in it where you're going into your higher range, for instance. What shouldn't happen is that the surface of the water changes quite a lot. So not all of a sudden when you're going into your higher range, then the bubbles really start to bubble up, for instance. So I'm doing a little glide to demonstrate this. Also, just as an aside, experiment with how deep you're actually diving your straw in. So there's more resistance when you have it quite low, there's less resistance when you're having it a tiny bit higher up, essentially. So try what works for you, okay? So you're doing this. And so on. So the bubbling of the surface shouldn't change all that much. That's basically to monitor when you're going into the higher range that you're not driving too much breath, essentially, because it's not necessary when you're going into the higher range. You can also use it the other way around to monitor constriction. That's basically what people talk about when they talk about flow phonation. So at no point do you want the bubbles to completely stop. So as soon as you constrict in your throat or your vocal folds close too tightly for the task at hand, the bubbles will basically dip, or they might stop completely. So I'm going to demonstrate that once. Now you see, I'm doing it once again. So then you notice, as soon as I'm gripping here, and as soon as I'm closing my throat, so to speak, or I'm closing the vocal folds too tightly and I'm starting to squeeze, the bubbles will actually stop. So it's really, really good to use it with water to actually monitor, is my breath flow where it should be? And also, am I creating too much breath pressure? So am I using the right amount of vocal fold closure for the task at hand? This is what you do with water. Again, you can use glides or slides, you can use arpeggios or little fifth patterns or whatever you normally use in your warm-ups. You can also sing your songs through them essentially. I mean, obviously you can't really voice them 100%, but you can hum them, or you can myron them, as some people would call it. So essentially you're keeping your mouth closed, but you're trying to shape the vowels at the back essentially. So that would be another idea. Then what you can also do, you can essentially just use the straw on its own. You can use the straw on its own. You can use more resistance by putting your finger over it or close it sort of halfway, or you can just use it like that. But there you then actually watch essentially how much diameter do I use. This one is sort of somewhere in the middle. I would say I wouldn't go much smaller than that for beginners. And then you're starting again. Close your mouth really tightly. And so on. So start in your speaking range, then go up a tiny bit. Use little staccato exercises if you also want to work your support a tiny bit and your breathing. This is just basically to give you a little start to what's all this rage about semi-occluded vocal tract exercises is about. As I said, it's not rocket science. You also don't need to use the straws all the time. You can just use the trumpet, as I tend to call it in my studio. So what I sometimes like to do if people are a bit constricted, or if they're warming up, or if they're feeling a bit under the weather, make them sing with puffy cheeks. So you do something like this. Or they sing the melodies of their songs like that. Or your lip trills. They all create resistance, so they always build up this back pressure that you want in semi-occluded vocal tract exercises. So that was today's broadcast. If you have any questions about this, feel free to leave a comment in the comments section. As I said before, also feel free to join the closed Facebook group. If you'd rather not discuss your questions in public, that's a slightly more protected environment. And then I actually look forward to seeing you again soon for our next broadcast. And if you want to, you can even suggest topics that you would like to hear about. So I see you again soon. Bye-bye.